Okay, so the last sort of major thing that you need to be aware of for grammar is clauses and phrases, and that follows on quite nicely, I think, from looking at prepositions and conjunctions and then sentence types and functions, because hopefully some of this will already sort of start to make sense to you. So I'll start with the sentences. I talked about that in the last video in terms of sentence types and functions, but I think to understand clauses you need to start there. So the main clause in a sentence is the most important bit. It makes sense on its own. It's the independent clause. It exists independently to everything else, and simple sentences just have one main clause. I talked about compound sentences. They have two or more independent clauses. They're joined by what we call coordinating conjunctions, words like and, but, so. They join equally important bits of information. The cat sat on the mat, and then it got up again. Two equally important bits of information, both relating to the same subject, the cat. That's your compound sentence. Complex contain at least one subordinate or dependent clause. Generally, you can tell that because it doesn't make sense on its own. Although, as you get more proficient with this, I think the better way of thinking about it is it adding extra background information about some element in that main clause? Is it an additional separate clause about the same things, or is it adding more information to the independent clause? That's how you would tell. And I said one good way of doing it, and we touched on this when I looked at conjunctions, if you see the words until, while, although, because, those words are subordinating conjunctions. They bring in subordinate clauses. If you see those words, you know it's a complex sentence, you know there's a subordinate clause you can talk about. And then just in that separate box, I've put that reminder that you do also have compound complex, so where you've got at least two main clauses and at least one subordinate clause as well. So the example there, the man ran while looking really angry, and then he turned back again. So you've got the man ran, one clause, then he turned back again, a second independent clause, also about the man, additional extra information, but a separate clause, and then the background information while looking really angry that adds further detail, working like an adjective to describe the man in a little bit more detail. Just noted with these subordinate clauses, you might get two commas, so the man ran while sweating and breathing heavily towards the fight, or it might not. While sweating and breathing heavily, the man ran towards the fight. And that's where I think sometimes people get confused. Subordinate clauses are easier to find in that first box because you've got your two commas, you've got the while that separates it. But in that second one, that is still a complex sentence. It's just that the subordinate bit has been put first. The while sweating and breathing heavily, the man ran towards the fight. Then the independent clause comes later. There's three main types that I think are very useful to talk about, and actually I think they're a lot easier to spot and discuss than you would think. So firstly, relative clauses work like adjectives. Okay, they describe a noun, and often they will start with who or which. So the cat, who was old, walked really slowly, or the clock, which was standing in the corner, looked threatening. Yeah, they work like an adjective. They give us background information about the noun. They are clauses out because they've got a verb. Remember, was is a verb. In the second one, was standing is a verb. So they've got a clause, but they work like an adjective. They're just giving more information about a noun. Adverbial, similar, but they're describing a verb. So when you've tidied up, you can go outside. That works like an adverb. It's an adverb of time, isn't it, really? Because the going outside is the main bit of information. When can you go outside? When you've tidied up. It tells us when the going outside can happen. It works like an adverb, so it's an adverbial clause. The drama teacher kept a group behind after the class was finished. Again, it tells us when that happened. Okay, so it works like an adverb. Conditional clauses are probably the easiest because they literally give a condition. Look for an if. Okay, if you've done your homework, you can go outside. They'll start with an if because they're giving us a condition by which the main clause can happen. Okay, so if you can spot them, identify them straight away, you can talk about those clauses in action. You may at this point want to come up with examples of each type of clause to get your head around it. So clauses are the kind of next step down from sentences. Then phrases are smaller than that. Phrases go into clauses. Okay, so we start with a sentence, go down into a clause, go down into a phrase. So these are smaller than a clause. They don't necessarily have verbs in them. So a noun phrase is just a group of words that are based around a noun. So the examples are the old thin man or a big black violent dog. We've got a determiner, the or a. We've got some adjectives, and we've got the noun. Okay, it's just the group of words that are just in relation to that noun. There's no verbs there, it's just the words about the noun. Prepositional phrase we touched on when we looked at prepositions. They're literally a group of words that start with a preposition. They start with an at or an on or a by, or an under, or an in, on, those sorts of words are prepositions. So on the table, at the shop, so it tells us where or when something happened. Many of those prepositional phrases work as adverbs, yeah. So we'll be told that something happened on the table. I sat on the table. It works like an adverb because it describes where the action happened. Okay, but it's a prepositional phrase because it starts with the preposition and then has the words after it. But it can function as an adverb. Yeah. So what it is a phrase, prepositional phrase, but its function could be an adverb. And then verb phrase, literally a group of words about a verb. So ran hurriedly, spoke extremely confidently. It's your verb and it's your adverbs that link to it. Okay, so they're even smaller. So you get words are the smallest. They go into phrases. They go into clauses. Then they go into sentences. What that means is that you can start now, if you're confident with word classes, you're confident with clauses and phrases, you can start doing things like this, which is what you need to do when it comes to analysing text. So if the line in the text was, unfortunately, these innocent victims are still being let down, you could say the attributive pre-modifying adjective innocent, yeah, we looked at that in the adjectives video, and plural noun victims. Well, it's a noun in the plural, more than one, put together in a noun phrase, which we just looked at. Work alongside the adverb of manner, unfortunately, to suggest we all have a duty to protect the refugees, while the verb phrase, are still being let down, in present tense and progressive aspect, shows the failing of them still continues. I've taken bits from the different videos there, put it together to show you how you might analyse a bit of language, okay, by using the terminology to explain what the effect might be. Because these things don't have an effect on their own, they work together. You need patterns for OCR, and that's why. One word rarely has an impact on its own. It's when it's put with others that we see it doing something. So within clauses, you get those 5 things. They might not always be there, okay? You might not have all of them. You might have more than one example of some of them, okay? But a standard clause will have different amounts of these 5 things in. So you get a subject in there. It's the theme or it's the topic of the clause. It's a noun or a noun phrase. Who's the person or thing doing the action? So in that example, the teacher has called me a fool twice. The teacher is a noun phrase. Yeah, it's 2 words about the teacher himself, which is a noun, or herself, but that's the subject. They're the one doing the action. Then you get a verb, or verb phrase. So a range of meanings. What did they do? So in this case, has called. Remember, the verb can be more than one word. Was running. We get an object. Who or what are they doing the action to? In this case, me. Again, it could be a noun phrase. It could be just one noun on its own. Complement's the trickiest one. That's just a bit more information. That there can be nouns, there can be adjectives, or noun phrases. In this case, the teacher has called me a fool twice. Because called is that kind of I guess it's in this sense it works more like a copular verb than a dynamic verb. I know call, if you call out, it's a dynamic verb, but in this case I've called them a fool. We need the complement. But what has he called you, or what has she called you? That's your complement, okay? If you've got a copular verb or a stative verb, we need a complement. And adverbial adds, basically it's an adverb. It can be more than one word. So in this case, twice, or today, or on Tuesday, or at the shops. They're your adverbials. What this means is when you're looking at grammar, you don't just need to talk about the words and phrases. You could also talk about what's the subject, what's the object. Okay, we looked at passive voice. That's great because it takes away the subject. Why have they done that? Okay, we've changed here the elements, but the teacher was calling my sister a genius last week. Okay, still has those 5 steps. What you might want to do is pause the video here and play around with those different areas there and turn it into different clauses, okay? Some of those things, your Aunt Jane, for example, could be the subject, could be the object, could be the complement. It depends where they're put in that sentence. Another way you might want to do it is look at in each of those clauses, what are the different elements. You haven't always got all 5 of them. Okay, some of them have, but some of them have just got mixture. But you might want to, try and identify there what's the subject, what's the verb, what's the object, what's the complement, what's the adverb. They won't all have them, okay? But if you use that box on the right, it might help you identify if they're the one doing the action, they're the subject. Is it your verb, your doing, having, or being word? Is it the thing being affected by the action? Is it a description of the action? Or is it providing further information by saying what was had, or what had been done, or what was felt? Okay, in which case it's the complement. So going back to these texts, let's look at some of the clauses and phrases here. So we get that compound sentence at the start. I looked at it in the sentences video, but two independent clauses side by side. It shows the contrast between the Conservatives, who essentially won the election, and Labour and Lib Dems, who essentially lost it. It starts and any response to the 2019 general election, that sentence starts and then ends with Boris Johnson's Conservative Party is its undisputed victor. That is your main clause there. Okay, that's the bit that comes at the end. The bit before is your kind of your extra additional information there. Okay, the other thing to say there, the Conservative Party is its undisputed victor. That's a good example of a complement there. Okay, you've got your copular verb, the is. What is it? The undisputed victor. Okay, its undisputed victor is also a noun phrase. Okay, but in terms of how it functions, it's working as the complement. You get your copular verb, your is, but what are they? They're the undisputed victor. And by adding that word undisputed, suggests perhaps that the Guardian would like to dispute it but can't. Okay, so they've got a working majority. It says something the Conservatives have not achieved for 32 years. I want to show you that because it's an example of a relative clause, but it's not got who or which. Okay, that sentence could read, they have a working majority, which is something the Conservatives have not achieved for 32 years. They've left out the which because we understand we don't need the which for that to make sense, but that's an example of a relative clause, okay? That describes the majority. Majority is a noun. There's something the Conservatives have not achieved, works as a relative clause because it describes that noun in more detail. Like I say, it could say which is something. It is a party triumph because the Tories have recovered, okay? So that there works as an adverbial, okay? An adverbial clause. It is a party triumph because it gives the reason why it is. It describes the is, it describes the verb, okay? And then their claim to be Britain's most enduring governing force. I like Britain's most enduring governing force, good example of a noun phrase, shows their power at this time. It's also showing, it says, they've recovered their claim to be Britain's most enduring governing force. That's another example of an infinitive, and I'll do a video next to talk about infinitives. Now you might look at them. Is this one, however, he's sorry for the election disaster as he issues first apology. That's an adverbial clause. It's a clause because you've got issues as a verb, but it's explaining, it's adding more information of what he's doing. Okay, he is sorry. The is employed here. The newspaper headings often they miss out shorter words and prepositions and short verbs. But as he issues first apology, is your adverbial. It's describing how he is sorry. Another adverbial clause after Labour's worst defeat at the polls since 1935. Okay, it works to explain. Sorry, not an adverbial clause, but an adverbial that explains why the letter was occasioned. It gives the time. Okay, nice relative clause. The voters who abandoned the party. It adds more information about the voters, so it's a relative clause. Then we get in a personal letter to Sunday Mirror readers, Mr. Corbyn apologises for Thursday's hammering. So we get the prepositional phrase first. It comes to our readers and only our readers, and then he apologises. Another prepositional phrase for Thursday's hammering. So where is he apologising in the letter? Why is he apologising for Thursday's hammering? So those prepositional phrases work as adverbials to explain. And he says, we'll learn the lessons of defeat above all by listening. So it's an adverbial because it's describing how they're learning the lessons. Okay, how will you learn? Well, by listening. And then he talks about the Labour voters who we've lost. So again, that relative clause describes those voters in a bit more detail. And then this party exists to represent them. Another infinitive there, the to represent them. It works in this case like an adverbial really to describe the existing. Why do they exist? To represent. And finally, the one from the Sun, the adverbial clause there, as Nish bellowed. Yes, it describes essentially his fancies were in tatters as he bellowed. Okay, so it describes what had happened. Nice noun phrase there. Channel 4's alternative election night. That's a noun phrase. It's all one. Essentially, it's all group words around one noun, isn't it? He says the highlight of my general election night, which presented a dilemma. So that's a relative clause because it describes the night itself. And then, given how unbearable the Corbynists would have been if Labour had got a result, it's an adverbial because it's describing kind of why it presented this dilemma for him. Why did he feel that way? You've also got the the would have been. So that works there as an example of perfective aspect, which in the verb video I looked at, and then that conditional clause at the end. If Labour got a result, if Labour got a result, this would have been awful. That's your conditional clause. Starts with an if, tells you why or how it would have been terrible.